Good evening, welcome to MOTS presents MOTS Ado About Nothing.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing.
Where we apply the revolutionary MOTS scale to classic and contemporary literature.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing.
This podcast contains mature content, spoilers, language. You have been warned.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of MOTS Ado About Nothing. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Thurlow.
Hello.
Stephen Hermosi.
Welcome.
And Veronica Hernandez.
Hi-o.
So today we are doing Veronica's choice for a short story called Mauricio the Eye Silva by...
Roberto Bolano.
Yes, because I'm not going to butcher
That is
the
the
man's
first and
name.
ever time you've heard anyone pronounce it who isn't Veronica on this case.
Or Bolano, as you
No,
might
I'll just
know
say,
it.
I'm just going to call him Roberto because that's so much easier.
Call him the author.
Sure.
So I'm going to give this a funny description. Who wants to give it the full...
Veronica, maybe you can give it the description.
A quick
of what
synopsis.
Quick
Oh,
synopsis.
I'm going to give the funny one, though, first. It's a man telling a story that some other person told him about he hated being in the movie Taxi Driver.
Oh, jeez.
All right.
Okay. And the actual synopsis of the story is a man that seems to be, I guess, running away from where he's from and finding that you're
a drifter,
lost
kind of.
regardless of where you go if you yourself can't really find an inner peace, and running in some really messed up situations in the process of trying to find that peace.
A lot of prostitution in there.
We'll get to that.
It's coming. So I'm just going to jump in and give kind of a summary about the author. Roberto Bolano is a Chilean author, and he's known in the Latin literature world. The reason is because he had some really, really famous novels.
And beyond, I was going to say. Not
Absolutely.
just
Poetry.
Yeah.
He had certain essays that he definitely wrote in, challenge a lot of political issues. As I'm sure all of our listeners know, it's not the calmest areas if you were born in Latin America between the 1950s and to present day. He was born in Chile, and he was a middle-class family, and he traveled to Mexico and then back to Chile and then back to Mexico, back to Chile, got pretty much exiled from Chile and sent anywhere else. He could never go back, and ended up in Europe and finally passing away in Spain, in Catalan. He was known politically for being very vocal against certain leaders, specifically Salvador Allende, who was the one who took over Chile after Pinochet. And it was a very, very dangerous, violent, treacherous, dark time in Latin America. And so you really see that coming out in all of his stories. It's not really a peaceful story. It's always violence. It's always darkness. And this story in particular is one of his more famous short stories because it's much more graphic, but yet his style...
Certainly is that.
Oh, yes. His style and the overall message, I think, this is not an upper.
We'll get to it. Yeah.
Actually, I found out after I read this story that this isn't my first encounter with the author.
Sure.
I read about a fifth of 2666 or 2666, however you pronounce that work. But I was I didn't. Again,
It's just
I
the
never
numbers in
thought,
Spanish. It's fine.
I never thought that I would encounter this author again. And surprise, surprise. So let's start up. Scott, do you want to start with the introduction?
Sure. So it's sort of a framing device where does the protagonist or the narrator have a name?
I do not
I
believe
don't
so.
believe he does, right?
No, they never state him.
it's-
They talk about him.
He's unnamed narrator.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's describing his relationship to this associate of his that he knows sort of runs in the same literary-ish kind of circles, like political
Specifically,
circles.
the Chilean exiles
Yes.
who are not allowed to go back to their country for
Right.
their vocalism.
So they sort of have a camaraderie. He's like, but he's speaking about Mauricio Silva, the Eye, in quote, that's his nickname, they call him. So it gives a brief little history of his dealings with him. He's part of their little exiled kind of group, but even it seems to me, I got the impression that Mauricio was on the fringes of that group even.
He was an outsider.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was an outsider. I think they specifically say.
Yeah.
Because
a respected one.
Because he was
but-
homosexual.
Well,
Well,
rumored
yeah.
to be,
Right.
No, well,
but then revealed to be. But they didn't know that at the time. At least the characters themselves. But regardless,
which
good.
is a very interesting initial characterization because you never actually really get to know Mauricio. You
It's all
only get-
secondhand description. Yeah.
So you're dealing with an expat who's can't go home, but he's even. I thought it was very interesting that all of his fellow expats are considered left of spectrum when it comes to politics. They're all kind of Marxist socialists, and they look down upon him for being a homosexual. And they briefly mention the kind of tendency for the extreme left to have the same prejudices as the extreme right that had taken
Sure, you get
over
little
Chile.
hints of irony about that, or
So,
not irony,
Mauricio is a man completely out of
hypocrisy.
place.
Yes. So I would say the intro sort of drops off when it's like a maybe page or two or so of description of him and his dealings, the author or the narrator's dealings, and what his impression essentially, and what he was last seen doing this. The last I heard, he was off painting or working as a photographer, and then they encounter each other again in Paris. Is it what?
Paris.
Yes. So he encounters years later. The narrator encounters Mauricio. I think that's about where the body begins.
I think they encountered each other in Berlin, though, didn't they?
I don't remember where it was.
They go to Paris, and they don't.
It was
he's
one of those
there, but they
cities.
don't. He says the narrator says that he wasn't really looking. He asked after him, but it wasn't really searching for him. And then they ended up meeting.
Yeah,
up in
whichever
Berlin.
city they actually meet each other in, I think that's where it kicks off.
Yeah.
The body would kick off.
Yes,
So
I absolutely agree.
it's like it's hard to describe the introduction, or at least score it, because I don't want to say it's dry, but it's just like sort of like a bunch of facts. Like this guy was like this, and he was was rumored to be gay, and I was doing my own little like expat thing with my other buddies, and then we sort of lost touch. So it's like sort of like not a brief description, but not a very in depth one. But I think it's enough to intrigue you. And maybe on that front, I'll give it a good score at the end of the day. But they're just like it's a slow build up, I guess I want to say.
It felt very much to me that it had a very familiar tone. It's almost as if he's writing me a letter and having been in this circle. That I was in Paris.
Yeah, it's
I almost ran across.
You're right.
Mauricio.
It's like a guess who I heard about or guess who I
Yeah.
ran into kind of thing.
So
Sure.
it wasn't in a sense didn't have much of a flow to it because it felt very much again familiar letter writing.
Yeah, it was informal sort of hey.
And at one point, I remember the author or the narrator saying, "Oh, I was rereading the original sentence, and that quite wasn't correct."
Yeah.
So it had a familiar tone to it.
Yeah, so I mean, while not perhaps the most arresting of introductions, I think it sort of slowly gets you into the world and the circles the narrator runs in, and again the relationship that he has to Mauricio, and what now is about to happen that they've encountered each other years later.
I've read one other Bolano story. It was The Savage Detectives, which is a novel that he wrote, and he seems to have this kind of way of writing that is like this, which
Yes,
doesn't seem to be all that
it's not
arresting
flowery,
as I guess. Yeah. But it has
but
a
neither,
way.
neither is it dull. Yeah,
But it has a way of pulling you in and like bringing you into the
Yes.
story, even though you're not really realizing that it's happening. And I think that's I would guess that all of his writing has that kind of feel to it.
yeah. Well, real quick, I also I read on Veronica's recommendation outside of this cast. I read I'm about halfway through, maybe a little bit less of 2666 as well, and you could see the similarities between these two pieces.
Yeah, I
Even though
read the
they're
first
different.
section of it. It's divided into
Right.
I think
I
5.
think I'm at part 3, but regardless, I felt like, oh yeah, I remember his style, his sort of like way of writing. Even though, like I said, it was slower, it was still a very good build up because he's good at it.
Now,
I think.
Again, this is written for people with knowledge of the Latin America because he presupposes a lot of knowledge there. He references Chilean politics. He references, there's this little restaurant in Mexico City that used to have. Again, I enjoy those, but again, to bring back to the familiar aspect of it, it's written in a way that. It's in a way a Hemingway used to write about.
It sort of
Paris,
assumes you know this stuff and you might not, is all. Yeah.
So, for the introduction, I understand where you're all coming from, and I can definitely see that if you're not familiar with Latin American politics, you're kind of missing the point.
You might be a little removed from it, is all.
Right. But I also have to agree that it is a slow burn. His writing is something that as you go farther, you're really attached to the characters. You're seeing where are they going, what's happening, what's next. You really are not really sure what's the next turn. And it's very important to know that, if anything, it would make you maybe look into the politics a little bit more to get a better idea,
perhaps.
because he name drops big names in Latin American politics. And the second that people with that knowledge hear those names, they are immediately thinking this idea of war and guerrilla warfare and violence. It initially just comes into the introduction, and that I can understand and appreciate. But yes, I can see where you may be a little bit separate from really understanding where it's starting off with. And
the other thing that I think warrants mentioning is that when you read Bolaños's literature, not necessarily, I don't think necessarily his poetry, but I was interested in him, so I did a little bit of outside research, and all of his stuff, his novels and his short stories, exist in this same universe that's kind of fictional but completely built on the politics of Latin America, specifically usually Chile and Mexico, and kind of the people that exist, mainly the people that have fled from Chile and gone to Mexico and are now living there. And as you read more of him, you kind of start to recognize characters, and you learn more about the politics through reading more of his stuff. And I believe that the narrator in this, the unnamed narrator in this short story, if I remember correctly from what I read, is supposed to be the narrator from the first half of The Savage Detectives, which is another book that I read.
Interesting.
In his headcanon, basically. So there are all these fictional characters, but they're moving around in this really very real world of Latin America. And the more you read of his stuff, the more you'll recognize things. So it's kind of like becoming aware of Latin American street life by getting into his stories.
I actually want to bring up the point about the narrator, because he's really, even though the focus is on Silva, he's the framework for everything.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of interesting things about the way he describes the world that they exist in. When he's talking about what newspaper Silva works for, it's kind of like, oh, he worked for these.
Right.
He didn't work for the newspaper I worked for. I wish he did, but he worked for these other ones. And then there's a lot of,
and he wasn't exactly sure which one it was.
There's a lot of uncertainty there in his description. He also kind of has the feel of being a different class than Silva.
Yes.
That, not just in a sense of
That's
how Silva was
heavily
divided.
implied, I would
but,
say.
Like Silva's that interesting artistic friend I have.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not really
I'm part of the cultural group within Mexico City. And it seems that when he goes overseas, he's meeting, later on, he's meeting more influential people than Silva has. Silva's just working his job as a photographer. So there seems to be a sort of distance between the two, and so Silva almost has nothing in his life. In a way, it seems like the unreliable narrator, and I think that's really well established right from the outset.
Kind of unreliable. Just sort of like you said. I think removed is a good word. It's a bit distant, yeah. And two things. It's interesting that it seems you're saying that this almost could be like a letter from within Savage Detectives,
right?
Or like something like that. And something Veronica said, it's still. It also is pertinent that, as we admit, if you're not as familiar with some of the surrounding context, you might not get some of the references. They might not be as meaningful or impactful when he name drops something or mentions something happening at a certain time and where he was living in the aftermath of actual real life politics. But regardless, you can it still stands. And I didn't mean slow burn it as in a negative way at all.
No, neither did I.
And I think this is a well done one. Yes, you can have poorly done ones, but if you're going to start off with one like that, I think this one did it very well.
And I think to bring it back to the specifically the intro, I think that regardless of whether or not you know exactly what he's talking about, or whether or not you've been to Mexico City, these little shops or whatever,
it doesn't lose anything.
He does a really good job of giving you a feeling for what's going on there. You kind of feel like you can see.
He captures the essence of
what he's looking at, And I keep trying to figure it out every time I read something by him, because I don't know how he does it. It's all these just short little declarative sentences and these little backtracks, and every single one of them I feel like has this meaning that while I get it and visualize it, I can't understand how he's doing it.
To jump ahead into themes a little bit, everything about this is observers and perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I mean, it's the eye. So I think the perspective he gives you in viewing the Chilean exiles is not in a way the insider view that gives you the familiarity of it. You're seeing it through someone who's viewing them as a secondary part of their world. So you can absorb the narrator's perspective without having to know everything.
Yeah, you're right. Like, it approaches that, but it's not necessarily tied to it. I think I agree with that. And also, like, just be clear, just to say that this is a translation, right? All his works are. It's one that is well done. Like, I was impressed with both this and what I read of 26/6 of Veronica's. We had a discussion specifically outside the cast that it matters how well done the translation is.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, whoever is, do you know if it's the same translator for this one?
No, the translations that I recommended, it was close to his son's translations, actually. So once he passed away, his son did take that ball and...
Fair enough. Either way, like, maybe that's for style, but I have to say that since we are reading, in fact, translation...
I've said this so many times, it really does matter, because one language may want to deliver an aggressive feeling, and instead the translation is very dry, and you're missing it, and in it of itself, you will lose the entire point of the story. Right.
Well, as that we've talked about every other aspect of this.
This is all very interesting, but I'm giving it a 1.
Yes.
As far as the intro goes, I'm going to give it a 1 as well.
A 1 as well. 1.
So, Steve, we're going to move on to the body.
The body of the eye.
Now,
we're going to make that joke because I just made it.
It's all yours, man.
Mark it off.
Now, I actually want to bring it. Where do you think the body ends and the conclusion begins?
This was something that we briefly discussed.
Bad translation.
And the more I think about it, the more I'm not entirely sure. I suppose you could look at the body as going up through when he takes the kids out of the brothel, and then the entire rest of it where he's kind of hiding out could be the conclusion. And then no. You know what's the better part? The conclusion begins when the kids die, I would say. If we're going to divide it up,
I think there's a better spot to place it if you are forced to. I agree with that.
In that way, I would say that the conclusion begins after he has lost, like, the reason that he's in India. So before I go into that, let me just describe a little bit of the body. So we're talking about the intro ends when he begins to tell his story. When the eye begins to tell his story.
That's a good.
I think we agree on that
line.
And he starts to tell his story of how he went to
India,
and he went to Europe first, and then to
he was
India,
traveling
right?
abroad,
and then he went to India, and he was a photographer in India, taking pictures of like normal Indian life type of stuff, like
doing
that.
National Geographic stuff,
pretty much. And then he gets taken to a couple of brothels.
Well, to be fair, he gets paid. He gets hired to actually do. This
piece
author
on the
in
brothels
Paris is doing a book about red light districts all around the world.
So,
and he gets hired.
Silva does not choose to go there randomly on his own. It's for his job,
right? So he goes there, and then he is eventually taken through a series of events to this brothel that has castrated children, and it basically breaks his heart to see these kids. He takes a couple pictures, and then at some point there's like undescribed violence, I guess, and then he takes 2 of the kids and runs away with them to the Indian countryside, and then he kind of is hiding out for a while, like all the while explaining how terrified he is of the police finding him, and then like the Indian mafia, I guess, like catching up with him. And I think where the body ends is where there is a plague. Yeah, exactly. There's a plague that overtakes the town that he's living in, and he gets sick, but he doesn't die. But the 2 kids that he has been taking care of do die, and after that, he kind of has, I would say that goes into the conclusion, and he's kind of lost his meaning his entire reason to be in India. And throughout this, he has like correspondence with his buddy back in Europe, who like gives him money, or actually I think it's supposed to be his lover back in Europe, who is like,
I was never sure about that.
No, there was heavily implied that they were former lovers.
It
and
was
still had it. I think he actually had like,
he still loved me, but he said like
there was a line
in the story. There's a line that says like
loved each other.
He still loved me, but he had moved on or something like that.
He moved on twice over the course of the events.
Yes.
Now, if you really want to get a sense of what this is, it's either, like I mentioned Taxi Driver before. It's also 8mm with Nicolas Cage a little bit.
Kind of.
It's a very... When he's going through the horror houses, he initially gets brought to female whores, which the pimp realizes that he's not particularly interested in women. brings him to a male, and again, he kind of declines, so the pimp thinks that he might be interested in... There's this, I guess, cult or a religious sect that castrates like 7-year-old boys in order for them to be
filled
the
with the gods.
It's a ritualized thing.
And they pay the families, we shower them with gifts.
It's like a dowry, but not marriage.
And then they take the children and use them as whores later on. So it's very... It has that sense of like 8mm where you start going down these corridors and it just gets
a world you're not sure you actually want to get into.
Darker, and you don't want to be in. And eventually he throughout the entire work professes his pacifism. He doesn't like violence.
Yeah, and
until confronted with the moment when he needs to be violent in order to justify his own, in a sense, morality and sanity, I suppose.
But he refuses to even describe his violence. So it's more of like, I think it goes over in like 1 or 2 sentences where he says like, violence happened and then we were escaping.
Yeah.
You know, like
he did
basically.
Yeah. It was all red haze. Right. Something like that.
But yeah, I mean, it's... So this is the body of the work, and it's all this like really kind of dark, and the more you think about it, the more depressing it gets type of story.
And not only that, the way they're telling it, they're meeting up in Europe. I believe it's Berlin, might be Paris, but they're going to bars. They're walking at night as this guy is broken by this event.
Mm-hmm.
He's still looking over his shoulder, even when
he's still feeling the ramifications.
He looks
in Europe, so far away from where these scenes happened. He's still looking over his shoulder.
He's
and
still
looking
haunted
at
by
lights
it, which
and
is
looking.
He's
all
aged.
around.
He's drinking more than the narrator remembers him doing. He's kind of stuck in this loop, actually literally in the story where they start off at the park, they go out and they end up back at the park in the exact same seat. Yeah. And this guy is just a broken man from... he tried to escape the violence and was drawn back in.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very interesting storyline. And it's all told through someone telling you a tale about someone else told them.
It's hard... It's Conrad-ish, to bring up one that you particularly like, Ian. It's a Heart of Darkness story in kind of more ways than one, because he goes into a rather dark sector that is often underexplored, and realize like the true horror that haunts him in the aftermath of it.
Marlowe was telling about his adventures in India.
Sure. Mm. So
there is a sadness that carries throughout the entire
it's
thing.
melancholy throughout.
Really
even in his piece, when he, as much as I can describe it as a piece, when he finally finds, a certain, happiness of his surroundings, he's still looking over his shoulder and he's still sad about finding himself in this predicament because, again, he doesn't like violence. He doesn't want to face this ugly world, which is interesting because he's a photographer. And so, unfortunately, part of that job is to capture those moments of sadness. He was brought up in sadness. He was left to sadness, being as an outsider, traveling as, with sadness to capture more sadness and melancholy feelings in these scenes.
It's a haunting story, and the character is haunted by it at the end still, even.
What really struck me, particularly towards the end, is when he gets away with the 2 kids.
Mm-hmm.
How weird that scene was described. I think when he says he referenced himself as mother over the 2 kids, which I thought was very kind of powerful. In
it's
the
it's a very nice detail to include.
But there's always, again, he is the perpetual outsider. It seems that he doesn't even have, he doesn't speak the same language as these kids. He is protecting them.
He just feels compelled to save them because of what he's witnessed.
Yeah, they're out in the fields or playing with each other while he's
playing football.
He's afraid of being tracked down by the police. And then once he finds out the police aren't after him, he's afraid of the religious folk coming after him.
Sure.
Kill. So he can't even find solace in what would, in any other story, be a happy ending.
I'll go into more detail about everything that you're hearing now when we go into themes and style, but
the
body itself, I think, is heavy. For a short story, it's very heavy.
I don't want to say dense, but he packs a lot in there, and much of it is not uplifting, but that's sort of the point, and he sort of carves it out very detailedly, forcing you to confront it, which I think is the point, and we'll talk about that.
The first time I read this story, I took a very, very, very deep, heavy sigh once I finished the story, and it wasn't of sadness. It wasn't some sort of, I understand where you're coming from. That wasn't there. It was just this sadness that this character was
It's
able to
oppressive, I'll
really
say.
Yeah.
put through to you as the audience. And I think many times when I'm reading a story that may be sad and we might laugh about it or kind of just go, oh, that's not really realistic. The fact is that, as Steve-O mentioned earlier, this is all based on some sort of reality. And I think that...
Sure, that'll make it more impactful, of course.
Absolutely.
Agreed. The one last point for me, the fact that it's 2 tellers removed and it still is as
You're still
intense
getting
as
the
it
raw
is,
emotion of it, yeah.
I think that's very a talent that this author has, and I'm very impressed by that.
I agree with that. So yeah, my final thought is we decided, you asked where the body and conclusion sort of cut off, so I think we decided a vague enough line or a decent enough line that we all agree on, and I myself am going to give the body a 1.
Yes.
I'm going to give it a 1 as well.
A 1.
A 1 as well.
1's all around.
Okay, Veronica, now you have the difficult task of describing the conclusion.
Let's discuss this one
Since
now.
I think we left it off with 1 sentence to go.
Okay, well, the conclusion is the eye. It's him having to return back to the world before he was thrust into this weird, traditional...
Underbelly, if I like to describe it as
Sure,
such.
okay, that's a good word. This weird traditional underbelly that he did not expect and not want anything to do with, and yet was dragged and drowned in, really.
Mm-hmm.
The conclusion, he ends with running away from this because there's nothing left for him there. The children that he was trying to protect have, as we mentioned earlier, already died, and so he's running back to where he was, and it's just this man who is described as stoic sometimes. He's removed, but he's respected, he's dressed, you can see he's successful in what he does, and yet he has this emotional breakdown because regardless of him being able to go back to his previous life, he knows, and maybe this is the reaction that I got, he's going only back to sadness. It's really it's
Sure.
really deep sadness to just general sadness that has carried his life.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the idea that you can never go home. Like
I
he
knew
can go
one
back.
of you was going to jump at the chance to say that.
He can go back for sure, but it'll never be the same for him. At this point, his life is entirely changed and not for the better. He needs a drink to get away from his problems. And I think that despite the fact that the conclusion, if you will, if we're going to start it at the very basically the very end of the story,
split hairs.
the conclusion, there's not much text there, but there's a ton of subtext about what happens to him afterwards and all that type of thing.
Well, I was going to say that actually, oddly enough, for it being so short, it drags around to the entirety of their interactions in Europe between the narrator and Silva. And oddly enough, they're establishing piece by piece the conclusion while you're still in the body of the story.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
then when
that's
you get
true.
to the end, it brings all of those established facts to the forefront on why he's acting.
It sort
the
of
way he
crashes
is.
Right.
at the end upon you. Like, you're not expecting. It's sort of like it takes a moment for it to hit you, and then when it does, and it does so almost like doubly.
So again, it's a very well crafted story. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, and
I
that
would
probably
agree.
speaks to style. But regardless, that's going to make it I'll agree. Like you said, it's funny. It sort of like rolls into itself. So there's no like hard delineation. Here is the conclusion in quotes. The whole point of the story is to sort of like slow burn and then meanderingly lead you into that, and then it just drops that on you at the end.
It's a very, very abrupt ending.
Yeah.
But I don't think that... Initially, I thought it was a flaw until I started reflecting more
I
about
liked it
right.
upon original reading, and I think I'm gonna, regardless of where you think the conclusion scientifically rests, it doesn't matter because the whole story it is enough that what has come before lends it more weight.
I would agree. I don't know if anybody else has anything to
Yeah.
add to the conclusion, but
I'm definitely giving it a 1.
I'm giving
I'll tell you
it a
that
1.
much.
A 1.
one as well.
All right,
So we are on to themes, which I will begin with.
here we go.
We talked quite a bit about themes already, but I'm going to begin with the entire aspect of the observer, because this is a huge theme throughout. You start with we'll start with the eye, who's known as the eye for being a photographer. He's removed from his world because he takes photos of it. He is the professional observer that distances himself from the tragedies of the world in order to just document it. You're not supposed to change. You're just supposed to see.
Right, supposed to
You
be
have-
detached from it.
You have the narrator
Detached.
who also works in the newspaper business, reporting. He is uncertain a lot of the times throughout the work. He misremembers facts from the past. So you're as the audience are listening to someone tell you a tale that someone told them.
Mm-hmm.
So
He told Brent on the phone, and he told me about this horrible experience.
So I don't know. It's very interesting, and again, you have a character who's witnessed so many horrors in his life, who's seen his entire had to leave his own country in order to flee the destruction. Is determined to not only be a pacifist but be the observer until he saw something that he couldn't reconcile with just
Standing by.
and it broke him.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good man who was punished for being a good man. It's an interesting, you can't escape. Again, there's that old saying that the only thing evil needs to succeed is for a good man to sit by and do nothing. And this thing is there's enough tragedies in the world that it'll. I don't know if it's an uplifting ending.
It's not. You don't have to be unsure about it. It definitely is not. I'm going to tell you that
for sure.
So I'm hoping that this character, who I actually grew to like quite a bit, even though I don't know him, I know him through another person who doesn't really know him, but he seems like a good guy, and I want to see him happy. I will hopefully that something good happens to him later on. But in this story, all I'm seeing is
doubtful
this
that's the
tragedy.
case, my friend. And yeah, you're right. I agree largely because it seems, if not obvious, the story teases that out of you, and then again hits it home at the end that as Steve-O said, I'll sort of combine them. You can't go home again, and after having witnessed such horrors of humanity and life, you may not be okay at the end of the day. And I think the observer theme is a really big part of it too, for sure. There's various little hints, not even hints. He just sort of not hammers you over the head with it, but keeps sort of reiterating it subtly throughout, which I think works very, very well, of course, and combines with all of that to make his point and the theme itself rise up. And it's not meant to be uplifting. Sometimes life isn't, and here's a little sort of anecdotal example, fictionalized perhaps, but regardless, it just happens to people sometimes.
I think another thing to mention in themes is tradition. I think that there was this tradition, as we mentioned earlier, that the left, predominantly left, politically, were good about being open-minded about everything except for homosexuality. And I think that was a really big theme throughout the story because it starts off with he was an outsider because he was homosexual, and then he works, he's in India, and these children are being castrated as a form of tradition because they believe in honoring these gods. And so I really think it has a really nice connection there where he is being set aside or pushed aside because of
he's
tradition.
Marginalized, and sometimes doubly so now.
Certainly. And then he goes to India and he realizes that maybe it's bad that he gets pushed out, and it's not to minimize that action,
right. Not
but
to downplay that,
at the same time, there are these other traditions that are even more cruel and more just disturbing. And clearly, as the audience, you're reading this and you're saying, that's not a really big deal. It seems like this person has a lot to contribute to the community here. And these children that aren't even given the chance to really contribute except for being honored for a week during these ceremonies where they're given gifts. Well, at least their family receives gifts for just getting castrated, and then they are forgotten. They are forgotten. And so it's just, I think maybe the theme was that he lost himself because he could see himself in these children. The same thing happened to him. He was part of this, but yet he was involved because he was part of this small community, but he was also pushed aside because of this tradition.
But speaking of tradition, I think that he has a subtle little seed of hope in there. When Silva goes back to the scene where the castration took place, that place of tradition had turned into modern apartments for people to live in. So in a sense,
there's the briefest slashes glimmer of perhaps
that modernity came in and replaced the horrors of tradition. At least there's that one little subtle, because I don't see why that scene would be in there for any other purpose but to kind of reiterate that.
Well, I kind of look at it as I think it could be read as they just moved to another place. This is just moved to another place. There's no way to
I get that. That's
mark this down. There's no way to pin this down. It's just this is what the tradition is, and you
Way
can
to
go
stop
back.
how that seed steal.
You can go back, and it's like
it's
taking on a new
insidious still.
face.
Yeah,
Yeah,
true.
exactly.
No, you're right. Like perhaps, like, all right, if I just may interject real quickly, you're saying that perhaps he creaks the door open to the hope of change, but it's never out, and it's implied that in fact they could have just moved. It's still going on, just someplace else.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
Or that's kind of the way that I read it anyway. And you could read it both ways for sure. There's nothing that actually specifically said
Right.
that
It never
it
spells it
had
out.
gone somewhere else, or
Right.
like it was still going on somewhere else. But I don't see something like that going away, I guess.
Tradition. Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing?
Well, I'll get to that when we get to antagonists, I want to say, but I think it's a pertinent question. But I think we should wrap up themes, and I'm going to give it a 1. It's melancholic, and I sort of like that in general of art, because sometimes that's what life is, and this captures a very specific instance of it, but it hits you hard with it. I think it's very effective for that.
Yeah.
Give me a 1 as well.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a strong one on this as well.
Ooh, me too. Me too.
Ooh,
All
strong ones.
Okay, so we're going to move on to antagonists,
And
which Scott,
Speaking
is
of
your
antagonists,
specialty.
yes. So yes, here of course, as much as Ian loves themes generally, I like antagonists because I think it does speak to what you said, Veronica, about tradition and perhaps the dangers of blindly following. Like, yes, I rail against religion, but hey, sorry, sometimes that's the case, and I think it's painted in a negative light here, and perhaps rightly so in certain ways. Sure, you can try to justify it, but even beyond that, it's just the horrors that humanity enacts upon itself. Sometimes it runs under the banner of tradition, in quotes here, per se, but
Well said.
it may not always be that. But regardless, the cruelty that man inflicts upon man, and viewed through this one, again, specific little situation, that, yeah, you're right, it's still like, it's actually more, as I think about it, I have to give it more credit because, as you said, it's a double removed tale, essentially. So you're getting secondhand, third-hand even, but it's so affecting that, it hits you. And so, yeah, the antagonist, of course, is society at large, yes, as facetious as that may be, but sometimes that stands, and sometimes people don't necessarily recover 100% from it.
Yeah, in this instance, I'm going to completely... I know I often give you shit about that, but in this instance...
Actually is society.
I'm going to completely agree with you on this one. It's the society that decided that it was the best to castrate these kids and turn them into prostitutes that he's railing against, and that is giving him... That's giving Silva all the grief in this story.
It's his impetus for being, broken, essentially.
Right, and the antagonist kind of wins in this one. He's a broken
Life
man
is not
at the
always
end.
happy, as I say.
Exactly. Go
All
ahead,
right, I'm
Ian.
going to jump ahead for a second for protagonist, because I don't think Silva's the protagonist of the story. I think that the narrator's the protagonist of the story. If you want to describe the plot of the story, it's
I don't
a
disagree with
man
that per
tells
se.
you a story that another man told him. So, what conflict did the narrator have in this? Really
Being
none.
told this terrible story. Silva
Being
is-
confronted with the
in-
harshness of
in
life.
that, I think Silva is the antagonist.
The narrator even says during his conversations with Silva that he knew he was going to hell for this, but he looked at the picture. Like, he's like,
Yeah. Another nice little detail, yeah.
Yeah.
True.
all right, you know what? I'm just gonna do it. I'm just gonna look at it, and I hate myself for it, but I have to look at it.
Right.
I have to.
You can't look away.
You can't look away.
It's-
Yes.
It's a horrible
Certainly
truth, but
cannot.
you can't look. But no, I mean, I don't want to say what you said is facetious. It's something like you can make the case for either way, I guess, depending how you look at it variously.
But I will agree with you guys that it's this entire
But,
traditional thing.
I think the intent of it, though, is
Yeah.
that. So
Right. And I would say if we can... I mean, now that you jumped ahead into protagonist, perhaps we can even discuss both of these together.
Sure.
And we can just
yeah.
score them both at the same
Yeah, that's
time
fine.
later on.
I'm sticking by the narrator.
But
Yes.
I would say that I think that's a interesting way to look at it. But I would say that they are both protagonists of their own stories, right? So like the narrator is the protagonist of the beginning. He continues to be like the shell protagonist,
But aren't we all the protagonists of our own stories? you know?
yes, of course, obviously, that's like de facto the truth. So
I'm going to ignore that. And then Silva, the Eye, is the protagonist of the story that's being told within the story. So I think that they both have something to say as far as a protagonist, as far as they are both
as far as
protagonists.
you can label them as such.
Right. Now, that being said, it is interesting to think about who is the antagonist of the narrator's story, and perhaps just Silva's story is the antagonist of his story. Like,
Yeah, that's go ahead.
If if it wasn't a Hispanic individual, I would say that in a way, white privilege would be like, because in a sense,
But that's your society. Like that's always
But
the
the-
agenda.
but
But
no,
so
but
it's
the
so
idea
it's
is
rich
that-
privilege or
yeah,
like
his
upper
wealth privilege.
middle class
The-
privilege, I guess.
the
Is
narrator
what you're
himself,
saying.
I think is very sheltered. He gets driven back from classy affairs, and I actually think that speaks volumes to that character. When he's telling a story, he's not telling it about himself because he doesn't have any conflict. He doesn't have a good story. He has
No, that's true. Yeah, you're
what
right.
happened to other people that he's associated with is more interesting as a device for him to, if he were to tell a story.
And drives a conflict in his own life.
Yeah.
Like that seems
In a
like
sense,
that's
yeah,
what
that's-
he's most
yeah,
conflicted
That's
about.
what I was going to get at. And
Is the
I'm glad you
story that he
brought
is
that up.
told is what's really driving the conflict in his life.
I mean, it was somewhat humorously, but I did like the fact that if you think about it, he's doing those things, and he runs into his own friend Silva, and hey, they're basically, hey, how's it going? Let's have a drink and catch up. And he tells him this horrifying tale, and then he goes back to his hotel. And was like, well, that was god awful.
I'm going to write you a story about you won't believe what this guy told me at the bar.
Yeah, like
Which he has never
so-
told
yeah.
anyone else before.
Worst
And now I'm going to write a story about it.
Story
So I like the
ever.
case. I like the case being made that perhaps they can switch off or like sort of share sine wave the roles of each.
Mhm.
But regardless, at the end of the day, I think we're all saying that they're effective to whatever extent they are of each part.
I don't know if the narrator was effective though.
And you don't view
But
Silva as a
I don't view
protagonist?
Silva as a protagonist.
Hmm.
So I'm going to go by. I think the antagonist is effective when you view it as a. I think Silva's antagonist is effective. I think if you view the broader arch of societal issues, and that the fact that when the narrator is confronted with something that he would never
Otherwise,
ever
have been,
happen
yeah.
to, because that's not the circles he runs in. Silva has allowed himself to get put into a situation like this.
Or just did not even allowed himself. He
Mhm.
just was by
Yeah, but by
Sure.
his profession
Yes.
and all that. So I think Silva had, again, there's a reason that Silva has a much more interesting story there. So I view him as a supporting character, actually, oddly enough. And I think that the narrator, I'm going to give a 0 to as a protagonist and give a 1 to an antagonist.
It's hard. Like I'm definitely giving 1 to antagonist, and I think, like I said, like you can sort of divvy up whatever percentage of credit you want, but I think whatever that may be, they still get a 1 on however much you're going to give them credit for. At least for me. So sorry I spoke for you earlier. You basically just said the opposite of what I was saying we all were doing, but I'll speak for myself. Just me now. I'm giving it also a 1 on protagonist.
What about antagonist? Also a 1?
Yeah, I just said
Okay.
that.
I am going to. I think that Silva is a protagonist, so I'm going to give both antagonist and protagonist a 1 as well.
Alrighty.
And Veronica?
I'm going to give protagonist a 1, but I do have to say that antagonist, I would say a 0. I'm a fan
Why?
of the
So,
story,
okay.
but that being said, I think that if it were more clear in the story, it's all over the place. There's too much of it everywhere, and you can't say that the whole story is fighting against the protagonist. Like the entire thing is because the person that he's communicating with is, regardless if they're acquaintances, they are still interacting, and I don't feel like it's really driven home how.
So you don't agree that the horribleness of humanity is broadly the antagonist of this, and that doesn't get a 1?
Well, when you put it that way,
Well,
yes.
that's what I'm
Hold
trying
on.
to say.
So
But-
what do you view as the antagonist?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. If
say
not that, Veronica,
Instead of-
what is the antagonist to you?
Instead of
And
yeah,
I'm just saying there actually isn't one. Like, it's kind of what it seems like you're saying.
and that's fine if you don't think
Yeah.
there's one. We've done
Well, no,
shows before where
sure,
we've said there's
but-
not an antagonist.
just my understanding of the story was just that the antagonist was the whole story. Yes, I can see where you're saying society, and if I believed 100% that was
Viewed as such
who
is
it
all.
was,
So that's what I'm saying.
then
But
sure.
You weren't necessarily viewing it that way.
I
which
didn't.
is fine.
No, I
Totally
think
fine.
the whole story is kind of fighting against this one person.
So the story is the antagonist to the reader, if you will.
That's how I read it.
No, and I
no
like
matter
that,
how ridiculous it sounds.
No, I
that's-
realize that.
that's
No,
fine.
like I said, like we said about the body itself and so forth, the parts of it, it confronts you, the reader, with something like that.
But my favorite
But within the
parts
story
of the
itself, I
story
get
was
it.
the protagonist
All right, sure.
fighting against all of this.
Sure.
That's why I will give
All right.
Silva the 1, but the antagonist a 0,
Okay.
Perfectly fine.
and I'll kind of redeem that with the story as we go later on
All right.
in the other questions.
So we got to, now I lost my place on who's supposed to go next, so I'm going to go with Veronica
It is Veronica.
as
Yep.
supporting characters.
Nice, good pull.
it makes me want to cry when I think of all the secondary characters, to be honest with you. I mean, let's start off with just at the very beginning.
Well, that's the whole point. Like we just said, go on. Though.
There are the other Chilean exiles. They are passionate, but yet the tradition that they fall back on is heartbreaking, and it's still driven home. So I really appreciated that. I also appreciated the interactions that he had with the narrator's family. They had, no matter how briefly they were mentioned, it was nice. And you can have that, familiarity of going into your friend's home maybe, and your mother's, chastising
His mother always
him.
liked him. Yeah.
Like, well, that was rude. He didn't even say goodbye, and he left Mexico. What's that all about? I can hear my mother in the background saying this about all three of you. And honestly, and him traveling in Europe, he does have a possible and very heavily, implied lover. No matter how briefly he's mentioned, it's still, it takes, a really big, it makes effects on the protagonist, who's in this case, in my mind, Silva. And then the children in India, they don't speak because of that language barrier, but
they certainly speak, but not communicating to each other. So he cannot communicate to the narrator what they said because they didn't say anything.
And yet,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's okay. But the face, the expressions that are described, the settings, the emotions that are running high, I think it's all delivered. So I will give all of the secondary characters a 1 because I think they did what they needed to do in order to build the character and the story.
Well, I made this easy because I counted Silva as a supporting character, so he gets a 1 there.
Oh, you're cheating.
But I love me a eunuch. And I also actually particularly enjoyed the boyfriend in Paris of Silva, and the fact that every time, like, him describing all the different, like, oh, he met this other Algerian painter he moved in with, and a French bodybuilder. It was kind of nice little touches there that I thought, for a story that's very lax in, like, very influential supporting characters, aside from Silva, they did nice touches.
Well, again, see, this, if you count them as such, it's sort of like how we were just divvying up the previous two. I don't mean this to sound harsh, but I initially was leaning toward a 0 because they're just sort of like, again, I used this to describe something in the earlier, another MOTS do, but they're sort of prop, but that's what they're supposed to be, like, in service of the greater, message and so forth and themes of the story. They're not characters really. They don't have any arcs or anything. But of course they're supposed to stand for something. They mean something.
But they definitely have personality,
but not much
beyond plot servicing personality.
I don't know if I agree with that.
I would say they have implied arcs as well. Like the boyfriend has this arc where he goes from being Silva's boyfriend theoretically in Europe to he goes into another.
They couldn't have implied anything. Sorry, go ahead.
He goes into another relationship with a painter, and like this is a phase of his life, and then he goes into a relationship with a bodybuilder, and this is another phase of his life, and like I think that's heavily implies this arc that this character is going through without saying very much about it at all.
Maybe,
I think that's part of the genius of what Bolaños writes is that he can give characters these arcs without saying like anything at all about them.
Bolaño, go on.
Did I say Bolaños?
Yes.
But that's the harsh.
Bolaños was the character from Savage Detectives. That's why I keep saying.
All right.
I'm sorry if I.
But everything you just said, I do not disagree with. But that's what makes it hard to sort of cut this one up, or like to categorize this one specifically in the specific story because of the way and the nature and the structure it has. It depends who you count as what, and that's how much credit you're going to give.
And the other thing is the kids that he takes have this whole arc of like being normal children into going into castration, again, going into prostitution,
I understand that,
and like being pulled out of that world.
But I don't know if that's necessarily an arc.
Trust me, it's an arc.
All right, but like they don't. Again, it's the weird nature of what they represent in the story versus what they are as characters in quotes or capital C character.
I would say it's an arc that makes you as the reader work to get to
dig into it
out.
Yeah, all right, that's fine.
You have to fill in the details yourself, and like I think that's what makes
an effective story.
The world that he creates. So
if you have to
effective.
Work while reading literature, it's a terrible piece.
Shut up.
Yeah, it's already a 0.
That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Yes, it was well done.
Right,
Joe,
so what is everyone giving?
Well, I'm still trying to delineate mine.
Really?
Like I wrote down 0 initially because of the reason I said, but you guys all make good points about it. I guess I'm gonna have to go with like how I initially viewed it upon first reading. So my gut reaction, like I don't mean to diminish them, but they weren't characters enough. But
if they didn't work for you, then that's
but
fine.
they did what they needed to in the story. They just weren't characters unto themselves enough to give me allow me to give it a 1.
Okay.
Okay.
That's a reasonable answer.
I'm gonna go with a 1.
A 1 from me.
And a 1 from me as well. So I'm on to dialogue. Pass to Stevo.
How come not to me?
Okay.
Sorry, I was just looking at him.
Do you want to do that?
Not
Do you
you.
want to start on the
That's
dialogue?
all you, my friend.
Well,
I will
mean,
after you, though.
I think the dialogue in this is brilliantly simple. I think that Bolano's Bolano apostrophe S work is. I think anything you read by him is going to have similar dialogue, and I think it's genius the amount of meaning that he puts into these conversations that he has with his characters. I don't have anything bad to say about the dialogue, honestly.
I don't see...
Well, no, adding on to that, yes, you're right. It was very simple. There's nothing really difficult to get through. You can understand what they're saying. And while other authors try and use, more difficult vocabulary to get their point across, and there's a beauty in that, and I can certainly appreciate it, sometimes the simplicity of a conversation really drives it home.
I think you guys are missing a very important fact that there is no dialogue at all in this story.
It's very simple.
There are no
there's
spoken
nothing.
lines. There's no quotations. It's all because it's being fed back to you.
Right, he's talking
See,
about...
so-
but you can...
Right. No, listen. Of course, I'm going to get to that. There's no actual exchanges between characters.
Sure.
It's a story of a story essentially, but it's sort of like the Stranger Thing, where it's all inner monologue, or again, a second-handly reporting of something. So, in fact, the entire story is dialogue in a sense.
Right. And he relates
Even though there's no
discussions.
spoken lines.
The entire story is monologue.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right.
But
That's
I guess what I'm saying
No,
is
you're right.
that he relates
That's a little-
discussions that he has had
Right.
with
But it's like,
the Eye, and like
I'll give you an
he
example.
relays discussions that the Eye has said that he's had with other people.
But there's not a single sentence in this story where that is enclosed by quotation marks, which would
Right.
imply a spoken line by
This
any
makes it-
character.
Because theoretically, I should give it a 0 and give
Right, well,
style.
that's what I'm getting at.
I like the style he wrote with. I think that, but that's not.
Right, that's what I'm trying to get at.
This is
It's
weird.
another difficult one, but I think I'm going to lean towards a 1 on this one, because if in fact you decide that it's all dialogue, or it's all in quotes dialogue, because of the nature and structure of it.
No, we got to change the question.
Interesting.
Because if I'm listening or watching a play and judging something on a strict soliloquy or monologue, I have to judge that on that. I can't give it a 0.
Yeah,
Because this
because
is
I'm not speaking to
one-
another character. That's not the
But-
point of it at the time.
But in a sense, I mentioned it's very familiar. He's speaking to someone.
It's as if it's
It's
a letter
one,
to you.
Yeah, it's a one.
Yeah.
It's a letter. So it's very interesting, and I think I agree with you, Scott, that you have to lean towards a 1 for that.
I think this one is tied into the next question, that in this sense, for this specific story, dialogue and style are like one and the same.
I mean, and also the writing again gives a lot of character building. For
Yeah.
the
So like
narrator.
again, I want to give you a quick. It's like something like we talked, but it didn't say. Doesn't it say then we said this? It's we talked and then we strolled around and then he started telling me a story, and it's all again secondhand description.
Yeah.
But since it's composed entirely of that, I think that's the way I'm going to view it. Anyone else got anything?
I mean, I think that thinking back on it, actually, I hadn't noticed that. I guess
I just flipped through it to double check, but in fact,
I guess
I
I
was
just
doing it exactly the same time you were.
I'm sitting here
Well-
smiling at them because I did not realize this.
I guess I
took it as a
just made up
conversation.
all the dialogue in my head because it was, it goes from him saying I spoke to
It's so subtly
Silva,
and amazingly done that you didn't notice it at
Right.
all, and I certainly didn't until we just happened to mention it now, and I had to confirm.
Which is
That's-
why I'm just sitting here smiling, going,
Literature wins again,
Point
is what
taken.
Like and
point taken.
on on implied dialogue, I would definitely give it a 1
you have to. Is what I'm saying. I think
because
in this
I
case-
thought that the dialogue was great and there was no dialogue.
I think this is one of the most, this is one of the most interesting things we've ever run across in MOTS do, and I think at the end of the day, our cases have been made, and I would say you have to vote that it is.
So I want to give an example of what years went by, many years. Some friends died. I got married, had a child, published some books. That's the kind of style you go through. Of
It's a
just being-
checklist of shit that he's doing.
Yeah. Well, I think he actually makes that. No, the rest of the story will seem like an itinerary.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
At one point.
Mm.
But
I remember that line.
it's very conversational, and for that I have to give it. And that's I said both of you said you were not fooled by it, but you kind of bought into his style.
You sort of
very
glossed
well.
over it because it was perfectly done. Because again, the nature of the structure of it, that I think I'm going to answer both questions. This and style is going to be a 1 for me.
Yes, I agree
because
with that.
you can't untangle one from the other.
No.
I completely agree. Well, like the idea of the dialogue being implied through the style is really interesting, and I'm sure that's happened before, but I can't remember another time noticing that.
Let me just bring in it's a quantum physics. You guys don't like when I bring in quantum physics to art, but it's a wave particle duality. They're both at once.
Sure.
If you look at it as such, and therefore it's a one.
Yeah,
Both are ones.
Sure, yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Both are definitely ones.
All
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
All right, you don't have to agree about quantum mechanics, I guess.
I just like Stevo's sure.
I would have to think about that one a little bit more.
All right.
But
So I think we're going to give both style and dialogue. Everyone, unless someone has something else to say about style.
Have we all convinced ourselves or
I'm
convinced
convinced.
each other
I mean,
of it?
I love the style of
The
this.
first
even
time
outside
I read
of that, the dialogue
Bolano
part.
was phenomenal. So, and it just carries over to every work, especially this short story in particular, which is why I picked it, because regardless of how sad it is, he has this style that carries over from story to story that
100% agree.
it pulls you in and you want to finish it. You want to go deep in it no matter how dark he goes.
That's what I wanted to mention, actually, about his style, is that he is a poet at heart. He's originally a poet, and
That's a good point.
that
He is.
shows through in his prose so strongly. There's such a rhythm to his prose. It's probably one of the most impressive rhythms to a book that I've ever.
I'm actually going to give him a big compliment here. I think he's the poet version of Hemingway, because he was a very similar style of just short sentences, descriptive, but he has a little bit more of a kind of, I guess, Latin flavor than Hemingway does.
You know what's surprising? Just a fun fact about Bolano. He was actually a very big fan of Dylan Thomas. Hemingway, he was a fan of, but he was an avid follower of Dylan Thomas. There was a portion of time in his life where he was actually in prison, and he says that the only thing that he read that was worthy of anything that made his wheels turn was a Dylan Thomas article or essay that he had written, and it kept him going, and he imagined all these stories, and as soon as he escaped, he had these stories on paper because this author, he fed off of it. And that's funny that you guys mentioned Hemingway, because he was a fan, but more so Dylan Thomas, and it's harder sometimes to find that kind of influence in his writing. But
for sure,
these authors, they have their own styles, but I certainly think that
you can see
Bolano,
glimmers of it, I think.
Right. He definitely drives home this kind of style where these other two authors, you can really read it and lose yourself in that writing.
That's a very well said description, and I 100% agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've once again, because we're combining all these things, lost where we are. So
we're at the final.
Yeah, we're at the final.
We've all given dialogue
Scott,
and style.
I'm going to give you the beginning of recommendation.
All right. I recommend it. Like I said, I was somewhat familiar with Roberto. I will refrain from mispronouncing his last name.
Thank you.
And I know Veronica, you're a huge fan of him. That's why you chose this. And yeah, I like this one, even though it's a depressing story, more or less. But I sort of have a predilection towards those kinds of themes and stories, and discussing how dialogue and style build upon each other and are intertwined so well that it makes it a way more effective story than if you had probably another author tried to attempt this kind of thing.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think that everybody that enjoys good prose and enjoys good poetry should read Bolano at some point, because I think he combines the best of those in, like, his prose is so rhythmic, and it just, like, kind of gets you a sense of false security, but he has no qualms about getting very graphic and violent with his stories, and you kind of just get shocked into that at some point in everything that I've read by him. He throws something in there and you're like, whoa, like, holy shit, like, take it easy. But it's
not done just for shock value, though.
No, of course not. No. It's done with, like, such care to the language and how it's written that I would definitely recommend it.
I like this story, but I don't know if I would recommend this story.
Not for everybody, I guess is what you're saying.
Not only that, but I think that Roberto is an important author. And I don't know if I'd want people turned off by it. I don't know if I want this to be the introductory piece I would give to someone. I'd actually like to read...
That's an interesting distinction for sure, yes.
I'd actually like to read more of his work to see if I can find something
you would
better.
Recommend first?
Like, again, this isn't my first...
foray into Roberto, yes.
So, I don't know. Again, I think that I would be very hesitant to give this a 1, So I'm going to give this a very soft 0, not because of anything wrong with this work in particular, but
just of what it tries to address and how it does, I guess is what you're saying.
I think that there's a certain
shock value, maybe. I'm sorry for interrupting. Go on.
What were we saying?
I was just going to say maybe the shock value, because I have to agree with Ian.
I don't think it is just shock value. Like, it seems like that on the surface, but he does it so well. As Steve just said, like, his prose is so artistically put together that it's sort of like it makes it has a dark beauty to it, I guess I want to say about it.
I want to let Ian finish off, but I'll
I'll
kind of like
go
on from him for sure.
Yeah, yes, it has a dark beauty to it, but it's to the point of, again, I think that there's something else by him.
I completely see what you mean.
I would want to be the introductory piece. If someone is familiar with him, I would recommend this. Yeah. But as a blanket thing, I would say maybe check out some of his other works.
Yeah, you're right. It's a tough question because you would say to someone, "This is a great story," but I'm not sure if I would want you to start out reading him with this particular one, and that's completely valid.
And just to feed off of Ian, I completely understand, because that was what I was going to say originally. That was what I was going to say originally. Sorry, I'm mumbling my words together here. His poetry is phenomenal, and Steve and Scott both know that I am a huge poetry fan.
Yes.
Huge. That's my area. I love it. And that is one of the things that really attracts me to Bolano. And I have to agree with you. Maybe the first book that you read from him, certainly not the one that I would recommend. I've recommended, Savage Detectives and 2666 before I would ever recommend the short story. But if they were bigger poetry readers, maybe I would suggest some of those, because the story that builds out of a couple lines that he writes is amazing. And so I understand where you're coming from. I would still recommend this regardless. If someone ever said, hey, throw in a couple stories that, this would be on that list, it would be top 3, but certainly maybe not the first one. I would certainly recommend it though.
Mm-hmm. So is that a 0 or 1?
That's a solid, hard 1.
Okay. So we are at the final scores now. Stephen Ormosi gave it a perfect 10. Veronica and Scott both gave it a 9, and as always, the curmudgeonly old Ian gave it the lowest score of an 8, making a aggregate score of 9, which I think is very.
I still think that's damn fair. I think that's a good score.
So,
I would agree.
For the audience, don't get scared by the dark story about castration and children. I think that once you read it, you'll see the beauty in it, and you can kind of see where he's coming from. You have to remember that there's a lot of other things with the story. It's not always just the surface. I hope everyone does take a look at Bolano. He's certainly worthy of it.
I definitely agree. So I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Scott Pillow.
I'm to go cry myself endlessly right now.
Stephen Ramosi.
Have a good night.
And Veronica Hernandez.
Have a good evening.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing. Music by Chris Morgan. Editing and engineering by Stephen Ramosi.
MOTS Ado About Nothing.
This has been a Los Alamos production. All rights reserved.